Before we get into today's lesson, I want to just point out the fact that we are 1 week into the new year, and so if my math is correct, that means approximately 100% of individuals who actually made a resolution have probably flaked on it in some way, shape, or form. So if that is you, and even if it's not, then I have good news. I have an easy resolution that you can do, and I really mean it. We all know that we should be getting into our Bibles as much as possible, right? But for a lot of us, it's really, really hard, whether it's because of a time thing or because it seems like reading the Bible is like reading a foreign language or whatever the case may be. So I am going to make this as easy as humanly possible. We are putting together 2 separate things that you can choose from as like a reading plan, and each plan will have things that we will send out via email every single day. It'll have the scripture right there in it, and I have a little slug statement associated with it that you can read just to have some additional context. So and it'll just be 6 weeks starting on January 16th, 4 days a week. Okay, so this is 4 days. You have a little bit of slop in there if a day gets away from you or something like that. So if you're interested in doing something like that, very simple reading, very easily delivered to you, then let your host know or let me know, and we will get you signed up for it so that starting here in a week, we will be ready to pick this up and work through a couple books of the Bible. So one of the options will be Proverbs, just kind of general wisdom for your everyday life, and the other one would be Ecclesiastes. Now, if you are a very cynical individual, or if you are an individual that looks at the world and you just can't reconcile it with a lot of the bubblegummy crap that a lot of Christians try telling you the world can be, then Ecclesiastes is the book for you. It is awesome. First book that I ever read on my own as a kid, and I highly encourage it. So with that being said, if you're interested, please let me know and we'll get you signed up. That's it. We'll go ahead and get into today's lesson. I am developing quite a list of phrases that some individuals find absolutely reprehensible. Forget the fact that I'm even a pastor, just, being a Christian. And it's not necessarily that, it's insulting or anything like that, even though I have talked about people having exciting testimonies where they were addicted to hookers and blow. There's context to that. I'll tell you about the story later. Okay, so that was a crazy thing that I just said, and it requires a little bit of explanation. I'm not going to go long because Char says I'll talk too long, but I have to explain that. The reason why one of these phrases that is on my list of things that I've said multiple times before is hookers and blow is because I would always get annoyed at the type of template people give you for how you give your testimony when they always say, and I know it's in all these books, I'm sure a lot of you were taught this way, you should tell somebody who you were before you came to know Christ, how you came to know Christ, and who you are now that you have Christ. And I've always said that doesn't really work if you kind of grew up in a boring household or if you grew up in the church, because then, like for me, it's okay, well, who you were before you came to know Christ was you're a kid who kind of like ate your vegetables and did what you were told to do and went to Boy Scouts, and then you came to know Christ, and then you were still the kid who did what you were told and ate your vegetables and went to Boy Scouts. So like, it's not like that doesn't explain anything to anybody about what Christ is doing in your life. So the hyperbolic way, just to make a point that I used to say that, was that model of testimony works really well if you used to be addicted to like hookers and blow, and then you're like, man, I was in all this stuff, and then I'm came to know Christ, and now I don't do all that stuff. Like, that's a crazy testimony. That's an amazing testimony, which is stupid, and it may sound humorous, but it's not funny when you get volunteered to be like the one youth pastor that's over at summer camp that's supposed to be with a poor camp counselor who had no idea who I was, and you have a couple dozen high school kids and middle school kids, and all of a sudden they bounce the question to you, oh, hey, so Pastor Joseph, how do you think that we should give testimonies? And they had already told me that I should talk about the little template, but I have a big mouth, so I said what I thought, and I broke some people that day. But it's okay, because I think they have a better testimony as a result of it. Hopefully they never got addicted to hookers and blow. So the moral of the story is, Don't get addicted to hookers and blow. But for right now, what I really want to talk about is a different phrase, which is that I look forward to the collapse of the Christian society. And I truly mean that. You see, the Christian society is something where, we look at kind of these 1950s values and you can say, well, by and large, something that was considered good and decent in society was pretty much in line with Judeo-Christian principles. And that may sound fantastic, but the problem is that it offloads a lot of our responsibility to make the hard decision to follow Christ onto society. When we start getting into a post-Christian world, then all of a sudden, the culture isn't going to do your Christianing for you. It's all on you. And what's nice about that, even though it sounds like it's harder, is that it makes it much clearer kind of where people stand. It makes it so that it's harder for people to kind of hide in this kind of vaguely Christian-y looking society and say like, oh, I kind of like Jesus, I'm good. Instead, people have to make actual decisions, which is to our benefit because you see, that's what Christ wants us to do. He wants us to make decisions in our life. One of the ways that you've been able to see this Christian society breaking down is in the popularity of all these phrases and idioms that have worked their way into our common language that we generally view as being very, kind of morally acceptable, or we view as being kind of good, wholesome things. So what I'm actually going to have you guys do is look at a few different phrases that are pretty common, or some variation of those phrases are very common. And what I want you to discuss is, are these things that you think are driven by culture, or are they things that you think that if we squared them up against the teachings of Christ, they would actually make sense? Is this something that's really that big of a deal, or am I making a mountain out of a molehill? Well, I think it is a big deal because you see, these phrases end up seeping their way into kind of our ethos. We begin living these things out as if it's something that we really truly believe in, and that becomes a real problem. One of the ones that I'll pick on all the time that you guys talked about in your groups is this idea of my flaws are what make me who I am. Now, I don't know how you guys discussed it, okay? So hopefully I'm not stepping on anybody, but this is a phrase that I really, really, really dislike. And it's because I can't think of something that is more anti-Christ. I mean, think about what Christ came here to do. What we see is that Christ did not come here so that we could remain flawed. They certainly don't define us. I mean, I look at it and say, no, absolutely not. God defines us. God created us. God had us planned before we were ever a speck in our parents' eyes. He knew who we were going to be, and God did not create us as inherently flawed individuals. He created something that was beautiful, a masterpiece. And when Christ comes into our lives, he comes in and he looks at the flaws, he looks at the blemishes and the scars and everything, and he says, I'm not just going to say, okay, fine, this is what it is and everything, and now you're going to become this new thing, based on who you are before. No, he comes in and says, you are made new. He wipes the slate clean, and that is such a glorious, brilliant thing when you measure grace against what he does in making us a new creation. So you can see how that phrase of, well, my flaws are what make me who I am, while it may sound empowering and it may sound like something that really helps to build personal confidence, it really kind of belies what exactly Christ did for us on the cross. He didn't die so you could be defined by your scars. He died so that we could be defined by his scars. That's a good phrase. That's a phrase that we should be using more often. So that being said, it kind of begs the question, like, what happens when we end up internalizing these different phrases? I mean, how does it actually manifest itself? Well, here's how I would put it. You basically have two different types of Christians that come out of, what kind of philosophy you hold. Are you a world-driven Jesus fan, or are you a Jesus-driven world fan? Really briefly, I mean, the difference between the two is that a world-driven Jesus fan is an individual that is really constrained by their concerns or the practicalities of this world, but they may like Jesus, Individuals who show up to church all the time and they do a lot of things and they volunteer and they seem like decent people, but, in a conversation when they're really faced with a situation where they might have to go outside their comfort zone, they go, well, I just don't know if that's in the cards for me. I just don't know if that's something that I can really do. Somebody who does that very well may be an individual that is letting the constraints of this world be what actually drives them instead of the calling of Christ driving them. That's what you end up seeing with the other type of categorical Christian, an individual who is a Jesus-driven world fan. That may sound weird to say that you're a fan of the world, but it makes a lot of sense. Because here's the deal. When Christ calls us, He calls us to go out into the world. He calls us to serve other individuals, to show compassion to individuals that are compassionless, to sit here and provide comfort to the afflicted. He's not asking us to hole up inside of our churches or monasteries and nunneries and just kind of, dwell within the presence of God. He's calling us to be able to show God and reflect that image out to the rest of the world. That's what He calls us to do. So you see, we're fans of the world, but we're driven by Jesus, which is very different than being driven by the constraints of this world and then saying, yeah, well, I like Jesus and I guess that's good enough. So there's a parable that kind of describes this pretty well, and you'll sit here and go over this in a second. It's the parable of the talents, which is just a type of money. And what you're going to see in here is that you have two servants who, even though they had very different outcomes, their hearts were very much being driven by the master without concern for what may happen, the risks as a part of the rest of the world. But then there was another individual who seemed like he was more concerned about the risks he might be incurring than he was about what the master had asked him to do. And in the end, that is the individual that the master was unhappy with. And as you read this, what I want you to ask yourself is, what is it that drives you in your life? Are you driven by the calling and willing to take on the hard things because, hey, that's what God called me to do? Or are you constraining yourself because of what the world tells you you can and cannot do? The philosophy you hold truly does matter. It goes directly to the mindset you have as you go about your day-to-day life. Do you have a mindset that is grounded in Christ, or do you have a mindset that's grounded in our cultural and contemporary world and the things that we can and cannot do and practicalities and all these other things that we like to use to sound like we're being wise when in reality we're just being a little chicken? What is it that drives you? And the reason why that question becomes so important is because when you see what drives you, you will be able to get a good idea of what you worship as your God. Think about it this way. If Christ calls me to do something and He is truly the God that I serve, then what else could keep me from doing what Christ is calling me to do? However, if I serve a God whose calling is subservient to the practicalities of this world and the things that the world tells me can and cannot be done, that doesn't really sound like a God that's worth worshiping. That's the thing that we all have to wrestle with, and it's something that we're never going to be perfect with. We're all going to fail. You see individuals in the Bible, great titans of faith, constantly failing and failing and failing because they're afraid, because they don't think they can, because they have these feelings of inadequacy. These things happen to good individuals. And yet, we end up seeing how God was able to work in their life. And so as a result of that, we should be looking at what drives us, striving to move towards a place where we say, I want to be fully and wholly Christ-driven, but then at the same time, understanding that every single time we fall, Christ is there to give us grace upon grace upon grace. That is the beauty and the glory of what Jesus Christ came to this earth to do. And so the question for us here today is, who is it that we serve? Are we serving a God that is beyond the limitations of this world, or are we allowing ourselves to be constrained by a mindset that is based on contemporary culture and what the world around us wants to tell us we can and can't do? I know which God I want to serve, and I pray that He gives me the strength and the determination and the conviction to be that kind of Christian. That's what I have for you here today. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.